one kind of scary implication is that, for years, decades, we've been using different pesticides and fungicides and all of these chemicals in our environments thinking that it's not going to harm us. We aren't bacteria, we aren't fungi. But there's more bacterial cells in our gut than stars in the observable universe.
Okay.
And so it's in like the hundreds of trillions. And, by harming them, we are harming ourselves. And, I talked about earlier how I was put on antibiotics when I was really young and how that affected the rest of my life, and how there's emerging research showing that antibiotic use can contribute largely to obesity later in life. So, by considering these microbes as other and not part of ourselves, we're kind of having to go down this whole other route of learning about the body and kind of under a new lens.
But I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of the show, which actually help make this possible for you guys, and that is First Form. They have a great product that really goes in line with the topic today about gut health, and that is OptiGreens 50. This is a low temperature processed ingredient. So this is low temperature, meaning it preserves all its nutrients. A lot of the phytonutrients in these greens actually function as prebiotics. It is a blend of 8 organic grasses and greens delivered in a 2-ounce shot of juiced greens. And they actually have travel packs, which are amazing. I always travel with them. Each serving provides over 1 billion CFUs, colony-forming units from 10 different strains of good bacteria. Again, people with digestive issues often feel really great when they add in a prebiotic. You can find this on their website at First Form. That's 1stphorm.com/Dr. Lyon. Alexis Cowan, welcome.
Hello.
Hi, PhD from Princeton.
Yep. Molecular biology department.
Oh, so total underachiever. Not sure how you live with yourself, but it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
For people that don't know, Princeton is
small school in New Jersey.
And also one of the best institutions. And you came out of Rabinowitz's lab, which, again, for people who don't know, is somewhat iconic in the field of nutrition.
Yep, absolutely, especially in something called metabolic tracing, where we essentially infuse labeled nutrients into mice and humans more recently to try to understand the fates of different metabolites in the body.
And what were you working on in particular?
So when I joined the lab, I initially started on an exercise project that ended up kind of flopping, and I had
as projects do, especially the things that you don't necessarily anticipate happen. And
and part of graduate school is not really just only doing the research and getting results, but also going through the process of understanding that failures are like teaching you how to properly conduct yourself in the lab and like how you can do better. So that's an important component of it, actually. But so after that project, I transitioned to a much more successful project, which was on ketogenic diet. And coming into the lab, I had already been interested in that diet because I had experimented with a bit myself.
And wait, and I'm going to stop you there because who Alexis sitting in front of me now is different than an Alexis in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would love to hear your story. Obviously, I know your story, but I would love for you to share it with people because you look fit and healthy, but you weren't always that way, were you?
That's definitely not the case. So I grew up having recurring strep throat in first grade, and I got pulled out of school, put on antibiotics for like several months. And my weight kind of exploded during that time.
And how old were you?
So I would have been like 6, 7 years old.
Okay, young.
Yeah. And now there's emerging research showing that like antibiotic use in young kids does lead to obesity. So, but at the time, doctors were giving these out like candy. It was the 90s. So antibiotics were really just given out so freely. And now we understand antibiotic resistance, and there's also drawbacks to them. So, my weight kind of spiraled out of control and that continued for years, basically up through high school, where I maxed out probably around 270. I didn't weigh myself at my max.
And how tall are you?
5'9".
So you're tall, but 270 is
a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot.
9.
And of course, like, I was very uncomfortable in my body. Like, I wasn't happy. And so I essentially just committed to going to the gym every day and starting to count calories, like basically did it the classic way, and ended up dropping 100 pounds in about a year.
Which is incredible.
Yeah, right. And I also like developed a newfound passion for fitness. I had always kind of been into sports and stuff, but I was never so great because of my weight issues. I played softball and tennis a lot growing up, horseback riding. Like, I did a lot of activities, but you know, as I came into my new body, I could now do those things with even more prowess and enjoyment. So from that period, I kind of transitioned into understanding how nutrition could work for me, because counting calories isn't really enough to find
And did you
health.
have to do it the whole, so you did it over a year. You lost 100 pounds over that year.
Yep.
Did you continue to count calories that whole year, or did you get a good sense?
I was very strict the whole time.
You were?
Yeah. To the point where it's like, it's disordered eating at some point.
Okay.
And certain people fall into that more than others. But I actually developed bulimia after that, after I lost all the weight. So that was what really motivated me to try to understand how I could fix the mental aspect in my relationship with food, so that I could enjoy myself, because I've always been a big foodie and like love going out and having like the finest meals.
Which is interesting, the concept of being a foodie and also having to do dietary restriction or struggling with your weight.
Yep.
It doesn't, and then also being very successful with weight loss doesn't always go hand in hand.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah, there can be some like conflict there between those different aspects. And it's really been a process of marrying those. And the way that I've found worked best for me is really prioritizing quality foods and eating, you know, cutting out all the processed stuff, like eating whole foods, cooking at, like learning how to cook. Enjoying cooking is really helpful because you can use all fresh ingredients. You know what's going into the food.
Well, I don't actually cook. As you know, I'm like, hey, Alexis, what are we doing for dinner? What are we doing? Anyway, wow, what are we ordering?
You air fry a mean steak.
Exactly, which is arguably not a great idea. You know, you mentioned something in terms of going into Rabinowitz's lab is you started on an exercise project, but transitioned pretty quickly to a ketogenic project. And when you were counting calories, was the ketogenic diet on your radar? Were the different modalities as tools, for example, fasting or ketosis or a higher protein diet, were any of these in your scope of thinking about nutrition?
That's a really good question, because when I was doing this, I was 17 years old, so it would have been
just last year.
Yeah, I wish. Actually 13 years ago. Yeah. So at the time, keto wasn't really on the radar for the general population.
Absolutely not.
No. And to a point, though, like higher protein, lower carb was. So Atkins diet was popular during, like, I think the late 90s, early 2000s and beyond. So that was something that I had kept in mind, especially because my mom had also done that at some point during my childhood. So it was like on my radar. But for me, I mostly didn't prioritize like one macronutrient over another, but I did mostly do, I would say, low fat and like higher protein, high carb.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was like prioritizing resistance exercise and cardio, like a balance of both at the gym. And I ended up, after actually that year of weight loss, I ended up getting into CrossFit and like Olympic style weightlifting, which like completely changed my life, I would say, because it gave me way more confidence, and then also just built like a lifetime of passion for resistance exercise, which I like still lives on to this day very strongly.
I mean, there's rumor has it that you've been over to my house multiple times, and we may or may not bust out a few kettlebell swings or even the assault bike.
Absolutely. Some random intervals during the day.
That's the way to do it. Let's fast forward to a little bit about your work. Really, the goal of this episode is twofold. Number one, getting to know you, which you will be on multiple more episodes. I've been trying to convince her to be a co-host. And the other aspect of this is I want to go through really the current popular diets. And in my mind, they are the ketogenic diet, which has multiple different expressions, a higher protein diet, which I think that we can define in the literature that's anywhere from 20 to 30% of the diet, but we do see it higher in clinical practice and in real life. And then, of course, the vegetarian and vegan style diets, and maybe we don't group them together. But to really get into some specifics, have some defining conversations about what those are, how are they defined, and then ultimately, what are the metabolic implications of each of those nutrition strategies, and what do we know about them? And you have pulled a few studies, which we're going to just highlight in terms of where we are in the scientific arena. And that's where I'd love to start if you're down.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We can dive in.
The ketogenic diet. And this is really where you've spent a lot of your time in terms of research. People typically talk about the traditional ketogenic diet, which is classically is a 4-to-1 ratio of fat to carbohydrates. It's 90-some% fat. I know that there's some variability, whether it's 70 to 90, but typically it's 90% fat, 10%, 8 to 10% protein, and 2% carbohydrates, somewhere along those ratios. But that's just one style of ketogenic diet.
Yep.
There are 4 others.
Yeah, there's multiple kinds. So the one that was traditionally used with children with refractory epilepsy, so this was starting in like the early 1900s. Doctors found that if they put these kids on a ketogenic diet, they were able to stop them from having seizures, whereas no other medications or treatments at the time were effective at doing so. So that's where this really kind of started. It didn't really enter the public sphere until more recently, within the past, I would say 10, maybe 15 years, but mostly in like the past decade.
Which is so interesting. So think about that. It started in what, the early 1900s?
Yeah.
It's been around for that long, and now it's making its emergence, and it's more visible over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And actually, I don't know specifically how that transition happened. I would love to learn more about that. But it definitely takes some time for things to kind of trickle into the public sphere from other areas.
All research, actually.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
I mean, we see there's data. How long is the average that they say? I think it's at least 7 years.
To like influence clinical practice?
Oh, it's probably longer.
Yeah.
You're probably
like
looking 10 to 15 years of, obviously I worked in Dr. Donald Lehman's lab and then Sam Klein's lab at WashU. And a lot of the data that is being done in the labs and is in the literature and in the academic world, that does not get out to the public for quite some time. And there seems to be this huge gap between bench work, even human trials, to then disseminate to the rest of the public. Which hopefully on this podcast we will help bridge that gap quicker. Because before, the way in which that was done was through conferences or reading. And now we have so much more in terms of social media and outlets. So hopefully we'll be able to.
Yeah, I think it was mostly a gap in scientific communication.
Yeah.
The scientists weren't really trying to bridge that that information into the public sphere. But now with the advent of podcasts and social media, like you mentioned, these scientists are directly interacting with the lay population, and people are able to kind of stay abreast of the newer findings. And
which is incredible.
Yeah.
And also challenging because with really good information, we're also seeing a explosion of really poorly defined information or perhaps misguided information.
Absolutely.
And that becomes really challenging.
Yeah, especially because people don't really necessarily understand the difference between, a successful scientific research study and what that means for them at a personal level, like whether that will work if translated from the bench to like the bedside. So part of that is understanding the different types of research that are going on. Like, is that relevant necessarily to human health? And just like how that transition can happen effectively. Yeah.
And we'll be able to run through a few of these studies, which I think are really important. And of course, we'll link them to the show notes. Going back to the ketogenic diet, we talked about the classic ketogenic diet. What's next?
Oh, yeah. So the classic ketogenic diet was, like you mentioned, about 90% fat, like 8% protein and maybe 2% carbs. And it was mostly dairy-based, actually, initially, for like the kids with epileptic disorders. So it was a lot of like milk, fat, butter, cream,
milkshakes,
cheese, probably, yes. And, now when people are trying to integrate this into their life in a way that's sustainable, it's been broadened into a couple different categories. So one of them is the modified Atkins diet, and that's about 80% fat and then like roughly 20 or a little like 18%, like 18% protein. And
so that's interesting. So it's 80% fat, and so that leaves only what, 2% or so carbohydrates. Again, this is a lower carbohydrate, more modified fat diet.
Yep. So it's the higher protein version of the ketogenic diet.
Okay.
And then there's also the medium chain triglyceride ketogenic diet, which...
Tell me about that.
Yeah. So essentially that could be, technically it could be either the classical or the modified Atkins diet. But you're essentially incorporating medium chain triglycerides, MCTs, into the diet as well, because they're very ketogenic. Essentially because they're of a shorter chain length. The fats are medium chain, so it's like between 8 and 12 carbons. When they go through the gut lining, they don't get packaged into chylomicrons like the other fats that are in the diet, the longer chain ones. They pass straight into the portal circulation, which goes directly to the liver. And then when the liver encounters them, instead of using them to like create longer chain fats, they're below a certain threshold length. So they basically just get burned very quickly.
So they're almost utilized like a carbohydrate in some sense.
Yeah. So they get rapidly broken down into ketones, because basically the fate of, if fat oxidation is occurring quickly enough in the liver, then ketones are the product of that.
Right.
And so you can take MCTs and boost your circulating ketone levels directly as a result, even if you're eating carbohydrates, but it can essentially help to make a ketogenic diet even more ketogenic.
Yeah. I did my fellowship in geriatrics, and one of the supplements that we used a lot of was MCT oil. And there are packaged supplements of MCT oil in terms of being used for the older population.
Interesting.
Individuals with neurodegenerative disease. It's so cool. And these were not individuals, again, as a geriatrician. The idea is that typically they're already in some kind of calorie restricted state. Older individuals, depending on their morbidities, are maybe not eating a whole bunch of food. Therefore, by adding the MCTs, we did see some improvement in memory.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Especially because there's like emerging evidence that ketogenic diet can be super helpful for people with Alzheimer's, other neurodegenerative diseases, MS, like things affecting the nervous system. So it could very well be mediated by the elevated ketone levels that are helping to improve learning and memory.
Absolutely. Of course, compliance is an issue, especially in that population. Anything else? Any other types of ketogenic diets? Is there essentially a carnivore style ketogenic diet, or that would fall into the umbrella of an Atkins style diet?
Yeah, so I think a carnivore-ish or a carnivore diet would fall more under the low carbohydrate umbrella. It's not technically considered ketogenic because of the high protein content. You have these glucogenic amino acids, so these are amino acids that can be converted into glucose in the liver. And so when you take in a bolus of protein, if it's large enough, you'll essentially get a little boost in glucose levels that will trigger insulin, which will then suppress.
But just a phase 1
levels.
Insulin response.
Yeah, exactly.
For people that are thinking that protein is bad for insulin levels over a long period of time, I would say we probably both agree that that's not true.
No, it's actually, I would argue that it's good because you're not getting like huge glucose spikes. It's just like a gradual, like a mild increase that's triggering like a low level of insulin to clear it, but it's not creating these big swings in blood glucose.
Absolutely. So essentially what you're saying is when an individual is eating a diet that's higher in protein, whether it's a carnivore style diet or just a higher protein diet, the body becomes good at generating its own glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis, which is what I would believe to be more effective than relying on the ingestion of carbohydrates. Then you are constantly chasing this ebb and flow of blood sugar.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely depends on context too. Like if you're doing very intense exercise, you're probably going to want to make sure that your glycogen's topped off, and so that's going to require a certain amount of carbohydrate intake. But for the lay person who's just like doing general activity levels and not performing at elite levels, it makes a lot of sense to get your glucose from eating protein.
Right.
and kind of keeping yourself from getting in the big energy swings of high carbohydrate meals.
I totally agree with you. And to give the listener a concept of a number, and I've spoken about this before, but for every 100 grams of carbohydrates, an individual, or for every 100 grams of protein an individual ingests, they generate about 60 grams of glucose. Mm-hmm. And of course, that varies depending on the substrate and the rates of gluconeogenesis. But that's a great baseline number. Mm-hmm. And individuals do not require carbohydrates unless, you're looking for performance or perhaps there's some benefit there. And, I will tell you just clinically, those individuals seem to do really well as it relates to insulin levels, body composition, and cravings.
Mm-hmm,
which
absolutely.
Cravings is a bit more subjective. But so with the ketogenic diet, during your time in research, did you look at metabolic outcomes?
I did, yeah. Essentially exclusively looking at metabolic outcomes. I did look at some anthropometric outcomes as well, like body composition, mm-hmm. weight. But essentially what I was looking at is how metabolism changes at the whole body level and also at the tissue-specific level in response to mm-hmm. a ketogenic diet. So I was working in rodents, and I would have the rodents on the diet for about 8 weeks. Between 4 and 8 weeks, it would vary, but essentially that could be equal to like somebody on the diet for maybe a year or more.
Which is really important to point out that rodent studies are different than mm-hmm. humans, and I think that there's a tendency to take what happens in rodent models to then say this is what is going to happen in humans, but it's different.
It's totally different. Yeah. Mice have about a 10x higher metabolic rate than humans. Mm-hmm. That's why they die after a couple of years, and then also they just metabolize things much more quickly. So whenever you're doing some certain mm-hmm. studies, like looking at drug metabolism or any sort of study that is looking at the effects of an intervention in rodents, right. You need to consider the species differences and the metabolic rate differences when interpreting that data.
Absolutely. And one other thing is their ratio of muscle mass mm-hmm. to body weight it's exponentially higher. Mm-hmm. And it's much different than a human.
Yep.
And another thing, typically rodents are fed vegetarian style diets. That's what they eat.
Yep, that's true. I mean, so they're technically omnivorous, but it's easy to standardize a lab chow, mm-hmm. and usually there's casein as the protein. So that's like a vegetarian style diet with like plant fibers and like different wheat or corn mm-hmm. added, which, isn't maybe too far off from like the Western diet.
Right. And then we think about the amino acid profile.
Yeah.
So the amino acid needs for the rodent is different than the amino acid need for a human. Mm-hmm. Especially they have fur and there's all kinds of differences. I think it's important to point out because a lot of the literature in nutrition really starts in rodent models mm-hmm. or animals, and then it's transitioned over to humans. But creating a proof of concept in rodent models, there are benefits because it can be done quickly, but there are also caveats
mm-hmm.
in that's different. I'd love to hear more about your research and what you found and some of those metabolic endpoints. So you were saying that you look at whole body metabolomics mm-hmm. as well as tissue specific.
Yep. So we can look at whole body metabolism by basically putting mice into a metabolic chamber. We can then measure things like oxygen uptake, carbohydrate mm-hmm. production. We can look at body heat production. We can look at movement, like how active the mice are. And essentially, ketogenic diet showed some interesting phenotypes. So we saw a reduction in fat mass pretty significantly between the control group, which was on the high carbohydrate chow, and the ketogenic diet chow. There was also a slight reduction in lean mass. It wasn't really statistically significant, though.
In the ketogenic group.
Yep. And it's worth mentioning that the ketogenic chow that the mice were on was more similar to like the classical like 90+% fat and 8% protein.
So it was a very, very high fat ketogenic diet, which probably most people, I don't think most people do that.
No, definitely not.
Intensive of a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, most people who are trying this diet out for themselves are probably doing something closer to an Atkins diet or a modified Atkins diet.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. It's really people who are looking into this clinically that may be into the really strict classical ketogenic diet range.
And the percentage, when you say high carbohydrate diet, so the rodents were given a ketogenic style diet, a classic ketogenic diet, and then also a high carbohydrate diet, was protein constant between the two?
It was not.
Okay.
So the control chow has 20% protein and like 5 or 7% fat. It's pretty low fat, and the rest carbohydrate. So it's like a moderate protein diet.
Okay.
Yeah. And so protein wasn't controlled. We still, having said that, we only saw like a very minor decrease in lean mass, which is maybe surprising. We also saw that basically these ketogenic diet mice showed a metabolic phenotype, or like a metabolic characteristics that were very similar to the mice that were just fasting in general.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So and I think there's some thought in the space that like ketogenic diets mimicking fasting. But metabolically, we showed this by essentially looking at about 13 different tissues in the body with metabolic tracer studies. We did.
And you know what tissue I care most about?
Muscle. Yeah.
Tell everybody.
Right.
What happened?
Yeah. So the muscle in ketogenic diet mice burns more ketones than their counterpart control mice.
So this, instead of skeletal muscle burning fatty acid, which is what it typically utilizes, when a rodent was adapted to a classic ketogenic diet, it used ketones
and fatty acids
in the muscle. Was there, I mean, this is pretty nerdy, but was there a percentage of one or the other?
Yeah, so I mean, it's still predominantly fatty acids. Yeah, probably about 30 to 40% fatty acids, maybe about 10 to 20% ketones, the rest being a mix of lactate and some amino acids.
I see. And for the listener, fatty acid, skeletal muscle typically uses fatty acid.
Yep.
And I think that that's really important for people to understand, with all the talk about weight, metabolic endpoints, that muscle, its primary utilization is fatty acid.
Yep. Muscle's very metabolically active, and fatty acids are the most abundant energy source in the body. And they're also the only constant energy source. So whether you're fasting or feeding, fats are always going to be around. In the fed state, you're getting a lot of fats from chylomicrons from diet. So those are being liberated and introduced to tissues. Whereas in the fasted state, you're basically releasing fatty acids from adipose tissue instead. But regardless, there's always going to be fat present. So that's important, especially for muscles like the heart, which, of course, rely on a very steady source of energy in order to function at such a high level all the time for our entire lives.
Forever.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were saying that the ketogenic diet, you were looking at tracer, metabolic tracers. The ketogenic diet, skeletal muscle used both fatty acid and ketones. And what else? What else was somewhat interesting or novel that maybe you didn't expect? Was there anything?
There was. So we actually saw that lactate and glucose were still burned largely by the brain, even after like 6 to 8 weeks of a ketogenic diet, which implies that the brain, still relies on carbohydrates largely to function. And that there is some evidence in humans as well that this is the case. So it seems to be like from the Cahill studies in Harvard back in the 60s, he pushed, I don't know how the IRB worked back then, but like...
So basically the IRB, for people that don't know, the IRB is a board that is required to gain approval. What does it stand for? The...
Internal Review Board, I think.
Okay, that's it. Simple. Yeah. All right, well, the Internal Review Board is required to kind of give its blessings on studies, and human studies are there are so many hoops an individual would have to jump through.
Yeah, but somehow
there's ethics committees involved. It has to meet safety standards.
Totally. Yeah. But they got this study approved where they essentially fasted people for 45 days, no food whatsoever.
I was like, that there's no way that happened nowadays. But you're saying then.
Back then, okay. 60s.
Back in the day.
Yeah. Fasted them for 45 days. Everybody was like considered obese, so plenty of fat to burn. And towards the end of the study, they did really interesting work looking at how metabolism changed in the liver and in the brain. But they essentially were able to get people's glucose levels down to 2 millimolar, which, like for reference, it's normally around 5 in the average fasting person. And typically 2 millimolar would be like you're having seizures and dying from hypoglycemia. But after having been keto adapted for so long, from that long fasting period, the people were actually still conscious and fine with the addition of the insulin to push down the glucose levels to 2 millimolar. So that implies that the brain can largely function with ketones after a significant adaptation period in humans. In rodents, it seems to be the case that carbohydrates are still needed to a larger extent from our studies, but that ketones did take over as a major substrate in essentially all the organs of the body, which kind of mimicked the fasting state, because we also did a control group that was just fasted to compare to. And essentially what you see is just kind of an augmentation of the amount of ketones burnt by each tissue. Yeah.
That's interesting. And what did you see in the high carbohydrate group?
So the high carbohydrate group burns, during the fed state, burns a lot of glucose in the muscle, in the heart, basically the brain as well, but basically the insulin sensitive tissues. So any tissues that when insulin binds, it can upregulate glucose oxidation and burning. So the muscle serves as a major sink for glucose in the fed state. Yeah.
And how did you take that study and did you translate it over to humans? Where do you think that the interface from bench or from rodent models to humans actually comes to light?
So the study we did was mostly exploratory to just kind of see what's happening in response to the diet. Ultimately, it seems like you're not really engaging any sort of abnormal metabolism or physiology in response to the diet, which does indicate some level of safety, which is important. So, since I've left the lab and right before I left as well, we were transitioning into a clinical trial in cancer patients, specifically pancreatic cancer patients, to see if this diet could be advantageous in combination with classical chemotherapy to kind of shrink the tumor and improve clinical outcomes.
And was there any results from this?
Not yet.
Okay.
So COVID happened, and then also there was issues recruiting because I think a lot of people are hesitant to start on a ketogenic diet, really maybe not knowing what it means or thinking it's too restrictive. Though I am hopeful that, in certain contexts where this could be beneficial with the emergence of new products onto the market, it's becoming increasingly more easy for people to adhere to the diet without feeling like they're depriving themselves.
In terms of metabolic effects in the ketogenic diet in general, perhaps not as aggressive as the classic ketogenic diet, have you seen other metabolic effects, benefits?
Of a low carbohydrate diet in general?
Yeah, or even the modified Atkins. I don't know if you use MCT oil or with some of the clients that you work with, if you utilize that. Just curious if you've seen or looked at any of the other endpoints.
Yeah, so there's definitely a role of metabolic flexibility in this kind of discussion. So most people go through their life really never fasting. It's just kind of always grazing, eating somewhat consistently, and usually snacking on carbohydrates, stuff like this. So they're never really engaging their fasting pathways like ketogenesis and ketone burning very frequently. And that can, come at a cost over time where these pathways are basically not active. And then when you do need to engage
because we were designed to go through periods of feasting and, of course, going through periods of famine or at least non-consumption of food. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, we didn't evolve in an environment where there was this abundance of nutrition.
And also to say we didn't also evolve into an environment where movement was optional. Movement
Absolutely.
is also incredibly optional, especially when we think about muscle as this metabolic sink. Really, when you are training and when you are moving is when muscle can really be effective.
Absolutely.
For the disposal of glucose.
Yeah, muscle contraction is absolutely critical to make sure that the metabolites in muscle like fat and glucose are turning over quickly enough. Otherwise, fat can be stored in muscle. Glucose is stored in muscle, obviously. Right. So if these pools become stagnant, the muscle's not going to take anything up. It's like a sponge that's full.
Right.
You need to wring the sponge out, and then it can take up more.
And what you're saying is actually very important. This idea that we are overfilling skeletal muscle is a big deal. And for people to conceptualize this, it's almost as if it's a marbled steak.
Yes.
Which is kind of gross to think about, but in fact does happen and is true. Not only does the muscle become ineffective in many domains of metabolism, it also becomes weaker. Contractile force is less. It is infiltrated with fat, and the quality of the muscle tissue diminishes. You put that in combination with an aging individual, you're in trouble.
Totally. And it's also influencing the inflammatory state of not only the muscle itself, but the whole body by influencing immune cell polarization like macrophages and also the production of certain cytokines. So you're just really fostering an inflammatory state that is basically begetting more damage to the muscle, more insulin resistance, less metabolic flexibility, more aging, like accelerated aging process.
Yeah.
And that can really all start at the muscle.
I totally agree with you. In terms of translating some of this stuff to the public and to the listener, what would be some of your recommendations for a ketogenic diet in terms of starting, how to do it, even why they should do it?
Yeah, so I think a ketogenic diet could be great for people who are maybe trying to incorporate some sort of fasting into their life.
But aren't able to fast.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Just to kind of ease into it, you can mimic fasting. Like I talked about before, our studies showed that the ketogenic diet highly mimicked the fasted state. So instead of fasting, you could incorporate like a high-fat meal in the morning to kind of keep the fasting pathways going from your sleeping period overnight, where you're already starting to deplete glycogen and burning more fat. So you can kind of keep those pathways active in the morning, for example, by eating a ketogenic meal first thing and then maybe pushing carbohydrates towards later in the day. And that doesn't have to be something you do every day, but it's just nice to be able to consciously engage these pathways at least a couple times a week to make sure that you're able to be flexible enough, because, you know, humans, we're like the most adaptable creature on the planet. We can live anywhere and we can survive in so many different conditions. And part of that is because, you know, we can go without nutrition, or we can eat basically anything and survive. So just being able to be in that very adaptable state is ideal, and you can kind of start to get there by incorporating a ketogenic diet and then ultimately add some fasting in, and it should be much easier for you when you try to do that.
Essentially, you're talking about metabolic flexibility.
Yep.
Which
Absolutely.
is definitely a hot topic right now. In terms of supplementation with a ketogenic diet, do you recommend supplementation? Have you seen evidence? I know that you're very evidence-based. Of course, evidence-based with the interface of practical application.
Yep, absolutely. So there's some interesting observations in ketogenic diet that basically mineral balance shifts when you're not eating a lot of carbohydrates. So you tend to actually like shed more minerals through urine. So
is that the keto flu?
That definitely contributes to the keto flu for sure. So making sure that you're supplementing things like magnesium specifically can help to make sure that balance is in check.
And is there a kind of magnesium, a form?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I personally like L-threonate just because it seems to be the most bioavailable, and it's also the only form that can cross the blood-brain barrier. So by taking L-threonate, you can essentially make sure that all the tissues of your body are receiving that magnesium. Yeah, so I would recommend that one. There's multiple organic forms, which basically means it's conjugated to something like an amino acid or another carbon-based molecule that allows it to be taken up very easily and used.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else? So you believe in supplementing with magnesium and minerals, other minerals?
So I wouldn't take calcium. If you were going to focus on calcium, I would first make sure your vitamin D status is in check, because that's the major calcium regulator of the body. So best to avoid supplementing calcium directly, because, you know, over time, elevated serum calcium can cause a whole bunch of issues, like calcification of the arteries and like atherosclerosis. But making sure vitamin D levels are good. Vitamin K2 is super important, though. If you're eating a high-fat diet, you are more likely to get adequate levels of K2. Supplementation doesn't hurt. That will basically help the calcium in the blood get into the bones and the teeth where it needs to be.
Right.
MCTs can be used to kind of help accelerate the ketogenesis process and get your ketone levels up higher. You can use things like you can buy ketone meters to see and like check if you're curious about where your levels are. I personally liked to use a ketone meter and a glucose meter when I was on the ketogenic diet, just to like correlate how I was feeling to the numbers so that I could kind of understand my body better. And I think it's pretty interesting in general to use like a continuous glucose monitor or the finger prick, just to kind of get a sense for how your body's responding to certain foods, the impact of like having poor sleep or the impact of exercise or not exercising, can be super helpful.
Yeah. I'd like to take a moment and thank one of our sponsors at Element, and that is spelled LMNT. This is an amazing electrolyte solution. Now, I have used them for quite some time. Now, they come in these really cute little packs, which are phenomenal for travel because I tend to get a lot of leg cramps. So this electrolyte solution, which has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, is so helpful for me. And as my discussion today, whether you are keto, low carb, vegan, paleo, you name it, you're probably not drinking enough water, and hopefully you're training and you're probably a little bit dehydrated, and this is a great way to replenish your body. And right now, Element is offering my listeners a free sample pack with any purchase. That's 8 single serving packs free with any Element order. This is a great way to try 8 flavors. You can get yours at drinkelement.com/Dr. Lyon. That's DRINKLMNT.com/Dr. Lyon. This is a risk-free try. If you don't like it, they will refund you. I really think you guys will love this and get benefit from it. One thing that I think is really important is we discuss diet, obviously, but just right now, it seems as if diet is a 4-letter swear word. Well, but it is a 4-letter word, and it just seems to be incredibly controversial, very heated. What's so interesting is there seems to be almost a repeat of history. There are things that continue on over the years. For example, the ketogenic diet. And that diet, which we mentioned earlier, has been around in the early 1900s, maybe a little bit later, really as a modality to treat for seizures, which is fascinating. So here we are using a nutritional therapy to change biology for a specific outcome, specifically seizures in children, which is huge. And now we're seeing various renditions of the ketogenic diet. Can you run us through the typical 4-to-1 ketogenic diet, the Atkins, the spin-off of the carnivore? Maybe there's 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think it's important maybe to note that there's like kind of a connotation now about diet being something that's restrictive, which is interesting. Like it almost has a negative spin on it, right, in today's culture. But diet is really just what you consume on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't have to be cutting out an entire food group, for example. But in the context of ketogenic diet, so basically the idea is to have a high fat consumption, which will drive fat burning in the liver, and the spillover from that process creates ketone bodies, which the major ones are 3-hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and then there's a third acetone, but it's in much smaller amounts. 3-hydroxybutyrate is the major ketone body that's going to be going throughout the tissues of the body and providing a substrate for energy production. So the different types of ketogenic diets are essentially just variations on protein, and then also about like how restrictive the carbs actually are. But ultimately, if you get too much of an insulin spike from a meal, that will naturally suppress ketogenesis, so your ketone levels drop in the blood. So ultimately, the goal of a ketogenic diet is to try to mitigate insulin response, to keep ketone levels kind of cruising along.
And is there a certain, from a clinical perspective, people can measure their ketones, right? And do people typically do it urinary ketones? Is there like a continuous glucose monitor yet for ketones?
Not yet. That's a really great point, though. I'm sure there's one that's up and coming. A lot of people do use urine test strips. However, they're not necessarily accurate after a certain period of time. As you become keto adapted, your kidneys actually adapt to basically release less ketones into the urine because they're basically saving those ketones to be used by the tissues. So you could kind of see a drop in urinary ketone levels, but maybe your blood levels are actually like consistent.
Okay.
So the blood levels are definitely the most accurate. And there is like a fingertip prick meter that you can use to like check your blood. Did you ever use that? I did, yeah.
And what was it cumbersome or was it pretty easy to do?
No, I mean, it's not super comfortable to have to prick your fingers like pretty frequently, but if you're just doing it, maybe once or twice a day for a week at a time just to see, how different foods are affecting you, it's pretty manageable, I would say.
And then is there a number that if an individual were to check, what that would be?
Yeah, so I mean, people can generally consider that they'll be in ketosis if they're around like 0.8 to 1 millimolar. Okay. And then higher than that is fine, but generally that wouldn't be considered ketosis if you're below those numbers. And a lot of people actually will find that they struggle to get there, especially in the beginning.
Why is that?
A couple reasons. So the body is, first of all, maybe not utilize those pathways very frequently in the past. So it could just be an adaptation process, like those enzymes need to be upregulated and the body's kind of adapting to burning more fat.
And is that typically, for protein, more protein-focused diet, it takes about 2 weeks. Is that the same for a ketogenic diet? I believe a ketogenic diet takes longer, right?
Yeah, it depends. So if you do a fast and you're exercising also, you can really get into ketosis pretty quickly. Like, let's say you do maybe like a 1 to 2 hour endurance session, and then you're also carbohydrate restricting that day. You could burn through your liver glycogen pretty quickly in that context. You could probably get it out within a day. And then as long as the liver glycogen levels remain depleted, then the ketones will start to be produced. And a major roadblock for people, I would say, is just understanding where they're getting carbohydrates in their diet.
Great. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, because even certain foods that may be considered low carb, like something like zucchini or eggplant, for certain people, when they eat them, they do get a pretty strong glycemic response. It's not entirely clear why that might be.
So what you're saying is it's different for different people. So you might eat a zucchini. I would never eat a zucchini, but if I did, you're saying that my insulin response would be different to the same amount.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And that's interesting because it's biochemical variability.
Yes, absolutely.
And we don't know why that would be.
Not entirely. So it could relate to like food sensitivities. People who eat a food that they're sensitive to tend to have a glycemic response that's related to like the immune response that could happen from that. But then also just rates of digestion as well, like previous meals that day, if you're coming into it fasted or fed.
That's actually a really important point, and I think that isn't necessarily differentiated in the literature either, is that sometimes when we look at a dietary pattern or a individual with a certain diet, one really needs to address the overall 24-hour food intake, what they've been doing. You and I have worked on some projects about myokines, and we know that depending on if your glycogen level is low, you may, for example, produce more interleukin-6.
Right.
And there are just variabilities within whether an individual is, like you mentioned, fed or fasted. What exactly is their nutrition? How full are their muscles? Those kinds of things.
Yep, absolutely. And that's really like a struggle on the research side of things. And then, as a consumer of the research, trying to detangle basically those results to try to find a way to implement that into your life. But the best thing is to just really try different things and see what works for you. That's why it's a perk to definitely use like the glucose or ketone meters.
And a continuous glucose monitor would be phenomenal with that.
Absolutely. So you could see your personal response to different foods and sequencing of meals and things like this.
And so back to defining, you were talking about carbohydrates and one barrier to entry to getting into. So I have tried the ketogenic diet. I have actually never been able to get into ketosis.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I thought I was doing it right. It's, I tried it in medical school and, I wasn't able to do it. But again, I certainly wasn't checking blood ketones. I was using urine strips. And I will tell you, I never lost weight. I actually tried it again in residency too. It didn't work for me.
Was your goal weight loss?
I think it was hunger management and weight loss.
Did you feel like you were more satiated?
No.
No,
not at all.
Interesting. Were you eating enough fat? How much fat
Probably
were you eating?
Way too much.
Because a lot of people don't eat enough fat. Like they think that they are eating enough, but then really like they're under consuming fat, and
Yeah.
if they're eating more, then they can get like the energy boosts.
I was trying fat bombs. The only thing that happened to me is I felt really soft. And maybe I didn't give it enough time. And again, I'm not looking at hard endpoints.
Yeah.
It was in the middle of residency. It was, that in and of itself is somewhat of a disaster. But I never was able to get into ketosis.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I definitely was able to get into ketosis. It wasn't something I wanted to stay on long term though, because I definitely felt it affecting my resistance training performance negatively without the glycogen stores available.
I did. I felt the same way.
Exactly. So it's not for everybody, for sure.
Yes. And perhaps long term, there's an increase in stress markers like reverse T3, and there can be hormonal changes. But again, it's always in the dose of how often, and maybe a ketogenic diet works great for some people.
Right. And it doesn't have to be something that you're always on. Like, I think ideally a cyclic ketogenic diet would be the best bet to avoid the negatives and the drawbacks of the diet while still getting the benefits. You could incorporate a high carb meal like once or twice a week, and then ultimately you could avoid the negative effects on thyroid, potentially negative effects on like beta cell function in the pancreas.
We should also talk about that. I'm going to make that note, because there is a beta cell function change that happens with individuals who go on a lower carbohydrate diet. You know what? Maybe we should just jump right in. So basically, right now we are talking about a ketogenic diet. We mentioned the very high fat ketogenic diet, which is traditionally 4-to-1, mostly 90% fat. There are different renditions of the ketogenic diet. Individuals would say that there could be a carnivore-esque diet, which is, could it be high protein? Maybe it's 50% protein. Maybe it's 50% fat. Who knows? I'm not sure that it's clearly defined, which in fact, in the literature, I believe there's only been one study on the carnivore diet. And then, of course, the Atkins diet, which is, 18% or so protein. The rest is fat and a small amount of carbohydrates.
Yep.
So the next question would be, what happens? Let's talk about metabolic endpoints, physiological happenings in the short term of a ketogenic diet. I use that word loosely. Short term changes. So obviously you had just mentioned that we switch to a ketone for energy. What else?
Yep. So most of the tissues in the body can then begin burning the ketones that we're now creating in our liver. Our muscles might be becoming glycogen depleted, assuming that we're still active while we're adapting to the diet. We're not really having much glucose that's going to be shunted there to fill the glycogen levels back up. Liver glycogen will be completely depleted if you're in optimal ketosis. Essentially, if those liver glycogen levels come back up, that will suppress ketosis as well.
So if liver glycogen is depleted, for people that are thinking about maintaining blood sugar, blood glucose levels, how is the body keeping that really tight level of whatever it is, 5 millimoles of glucose in the bloodstream at any time?
Yeah, so usually when you're in ketosis, you're burning fat, and this fat is in the form of triglycerides that are either from food or from stored in the adipose tissue. And when you burn triglycerides, you break them into fatty acids and glycerol backbone.
So they're using the glycerol backbone.
Yep, that glycerol backbone serves as about 50% of the circulating, like from gluconeogenesis of the circulating glucose. The rest could be a combination of amino acids, and then like some lactate glucose cycling that happens.
Got it.
Yeah.
So individuals who are in a ketogenic diet, despite depletion of liver glycogen, are able to maintain solid blood sugar levels.
Yep. Some people will see over time, you'll see a small reduction in circulating glucose levels.
Okay.
But it's not anything too significant, maybe just to like 4.5 millimole or something like that.
Okay. And what happens to some of the blood parameters that individuals typically look at, say with their doctor, like insulin?
So fasting insulin can go down over time. And generally, people might think that that's a good thing. But I think it's important to consider why it's going down. And something that's been coming up clinically for many people is that after they've been on a carnivore or keto diet for an extended period of time, maybe a year or more, when they try to reintroduce carbs, they get these crazy blood sugar spikes that then they're taking a long time to clear that glucose, which indicates that insulin isn't either isn't responding to the glucose stimulus and it's not being released, or that glucose isn't able to get into the muscle and other insulin sensitive tissues. So it's either basically an insulin resistance phenotype or a hypoinsulinemia, so insulin's not being produced. And it seems like the research is kind of still emerging in this area. So one hypothesis is that over time, when you're not engaging beta cells, so you're restricting carbohydrates, you're not making
beta
insulin.
cells are
the cells that make insulin in the pancreas. When you're not engaging them over long periods of time, they could begin to either shift to alpha cells, which make glucagon, another important hormone in blood sugar regulation.
So if blood sugar is low, the alpha cells release glucagon to help
promote gluconeogenesis. Yeah. So the beta cells could either be switching identities to another type of cell, or they could actually be undergoing apoptosis, which is like a structured cell death that cells undergo in kind of a programmed way.
Which is unusual if you think about it. How would that happen in nature, right? That just seems unusual that the beta cells of the pancreas would either, one, morph into or take on different characteristics like an alpha cell, or go through apoptosis.
Yeah, so I mean, in nature, you most likely wouldn't be undergoing carbohydrate restrictions strictly for a year more period of time. And it's like, because we've integrated this kind of dogma into diet where people think they can't eat carbs, they're bad.
Yeah.
It's like you're not engaging in the natural rhythms that you would have experienced in like the evolutionary environment where you're kind of eating what you can when you can.
So we're influencing just through mental fortitude, changing what would be perhaps a natural approach to cyclical feeding.
Yep, absolutely.
That's really interesting. In terms of blood sugar regulation, just glucose levels in a ketogenic diet, does that, how, if one individual were to measure that, would you say they're high, they're low? Is it just regulated?
So it should be about average, maybe between 80 and 90.
Okay.
Some people could experience levels a little bit lower than that, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. That could be a good thing, depending on the context for that specific individual. Conversely, though, for the carnivore diet, there have been cases where people basically have an elevated fasting blood glucose, and this seems to be an overproduction of glucagon because their glucagon levels also go up. It's not entirely clear what exactly is going on because the research is still really new in carnivore and there's not a lot that's published.
I think, one study? Maybe?
Yeah, there's one study that was basically survey-based out of Harvard, I think earlier this year or the end of last year, that kind of just questioned whether people felt like they could adhere to the diet, what benefits they got, if there were any negative side effects.
Oh, interesting. So it was a survey. I think you actually gave it to me. I have it here.
Yeah.
So this is out of David Ludwig's lab, okay? Or he was one of the authors here. Yeah, so this was out of Harvard. Interesting. And see what the results were. So yes, it was about a 2,000 response.
And the people basically were supposed to be on the diet for more than 6 months. And then they surveyed them over the course of, I think, a few weeks, maybe 2 months. And then we're basically trying to determine, how many adverse effects there were, if people were generally happy on the diet, if they experienced any health benefits from the diet. And most people in general felt very like they had a positive experience during that period of time, which I think is encouraging for probably research in the space. Now people will be more interested and engaged in trying to, continue studies on the topic of carnivore diet, and then we can hopefully get some more mechanistic and studies that will show us what's going on at a metabolic level.
I mean, there's probably something really beneficial in these, I believe that there is. I believe that utilized in a cyclical nature, there is probably some really good benefit to a carnivore diet. And there is bioindividuality, and same with a vegan diet. But, I think where things get really confusing is, number one, these things are not in absolutes. This is the first study on a carnivore diet. And it's not essentially a study. There is no intervention. It is survey data, which is wonderful in the way that it's the beginning of a proof of a concept. But but it is not proving anything, nor is it intervention.
Correct.
Important to note. Now, you actually were going to do your postdoc at Harvard.
I was, yeah. I committed to them. It was the integrative medicine department.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious why you didn't go there. What happened? What was your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, I was having issues at home, like my mother's health was declining. But then in addition to that, I kind of got some maybe uncomfortable vibes from a talk that I went to that was being given by a vegan professor that was in the department, or affiliated with the department at least. He was talking about a study that he and his colleagues had conducted that was comparing a vegan diet with a Mediterranean diet for different health outcomes, and they looked at things like LDL cholesterol. So I went to this talk, and they were comparing the effects of a study. It was an interventional study where they basically had two cohorts of people. One cohort was on a vegan diet, a low-fat vegan diet. The other cohort was on a Mediterranean diet. And each cohort was on the diet for 8 weeks, and then they crossed them over, which means that they each basically switched onto the other diet after 8 weeks, and then they were on the other diet for another 8 weeks. So it was a total of 16-week study. And they looked at the effects on LDL cholesterol, body weight, BMI, and I think blood pressure as well. And my experience at the talk was, during the talk, I was asking questions because the speaker was really emphasizing how great the vegan diet was for weight loss, and especially for like LDL cholesterol and like weight loss. And then I wanted to know how much of that weight was coming from lean mass, because over the short term, a vegan diet is going to be highly protein restrictive, especially for those who aren't familiar with how to like formulate a sustainable vegan diet.
Right.
And nobody would answer my question, and I felt kind of disheartened by that. And it almost...
But that's unusual to ask, you and I have both been in academic environments, and typically when a speaker presents something, there is an open discussion, and it's really important to be able to say, hey, this is a question, these are the reasons why we did or did not measure it. But to actually be dismissed is pretty unusual. And I don't experience you having incredible biases with nutrition. And again, we just had Tracy Anthony on, and I don't really, regardless of where her lab was, she actually started with Don Layman and is now looking at protein restriction. I think that a scientist, part of the role and the job description is to find truth.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned earlier that that scientists are humans.
Yes.
And that's true. At least last time I checked. I don't really know anyone from any other universes yet. But there comes with that, even the scientists have their own biases. So you were saying, I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but you went to Harvard, you went to go listen to this talk in which this individual is presenting data. And the next logical thought processes, especially when it comes to a vegan diet, is the fact that it is very protein restricted. And we do know that if an individual is not young, highly active, or doing something to counterbalance that natural loss of skeletal muscle, and lean mass is everything. It is not just skeletal muscle, it is bone, it is organ, it is liver, it is tissues. So there wasn't an answer, and it doesn't sound like you were even addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it was during COVID, so it was online. But there weren't...
Okay, that kind of changes it, but
there were barely any other questions. Like, I had 2 questions in a row. Nobody answered them, and like nobody else was really asking questions. So I felt like they were just purposefully not being answered. And then also the speaker is a notable vegan doctor. So I feel like there's somewhat of a conflict of interest there already. Like, he's been doing this for a long time too.
Yeah.
So that also motivated him to do the study, which isn't inherently bad, but it might introduce bias, like you mentioned, into the way that the data is processed, or into even like what you're choosing to measure to begin with.
Can we talk about that? Do you remember what some of these measurements were? I can...
they looked at blood pressure. They saw a decrease in blood pressure. They looked at LDL cholesterol. They saw a decrease in that.
I want to stop you. LDL cholesterol.
Yeah.
Mic drop. Like, there should be like sounds of pins dropping. Do you think that that's a good marker?
So I think it's a very like poor man's marker for lipid health.
Right.
Essentially, what you're trying to proxy by measuring LDL cholesterol is actually LDL particle, and then LDL particle is even a proxy for ApoB, because ApoB particles are really what's associated with atherosclerosis and the development of cardiovascular disease. But even beyond that, we kind of understand at this point that, cholesterol and even ApoB, maybe to a certain extent, aren't causing cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis, but maybe, they're like firefighters out of fire, and the fire being inflammation. So this like systemic underlying inflammation that's kind of festering for years over time, damaging the vascular system, the blood vessels. And then, ultimately these are like micro injuries that need to be repaired. And as any tissue repairs, like if you get a cut on your arm and you form a scar, the scar tissue is less flexible, and it has, it's different from the surrounding tissue.
Right.
In the same way, when your vasculature is healing, you're basically getting almost like a scar tissue that's hardening. It's not as flexible, and over time that can cause heart disease.
So would you, again, this is Harvard, would you have measured LDL-C?
No. I would have looked at ApoB, and then I also maybe would have looked at something like CRP, something to measure like the inflammatory status of the body, or ox-LDL.
And oxidized LDL. Yeah. But we do know that when individuals make a sudden change of their diet, oftentimes there is a drop in cholesterol, which then re-equilibrates.
Yep.
But there is an initial drop, and that doesn't mean it's clinically significant.
Right. And it's also worth mentioning that they don't like tell you about the demographics of the people who are joining the study, but it's a pretty safe bet that most people are transitioning from a Western diet, standard American diet, to a Mediterranean or vegan diet, which obviously is going to be a benefit.
Right.
So you're not really seeing signal from the diets themselves in that case. It's more so from the absence of the processed foods and the fast food and stuff like this.
And there was also a loss of lean body mass, which I don't really see reported. It doesn't seem like that was mentioned.
They didn't emphasize it,
And it was actually pretty significant.
Yep.
So half the weight that was lost was lean body mass.
Yep, in the vegan arm.
Yeah.
Yep.
But then again, it was regained after protein was added back in.
Yep. So when they switched back to the Mediterranean arm of the study, they regained the lean mass. So it seemed like the Mediterranean diet was pretty muscle or like lean mass sparing in that sense.
Which is interesting, right? And we don't know if it was skeletal muscle or if it was, liver or any of these other things.
Right.
So these are very interesting things that weren't necessarily highlighted. And I think that perhaps you would agree is that there is a quickness of society to trust something that is published. And one of the other aspects to that is perhaps taking a deeper look into what is the reason behind it.
Right.
Is this actually beneficial? Is it saying that it's measuring what it's saying? I love that there was an attempt to do a randomized clinical trial. I think it's fantastic that it was a crossover trial. I think that it is unfortunate that the markers, which typically we all agree upon that are more clinically relevant, were not used.
Correct.
As opposed to a marker that we know changes pretty quickly with a change in diet. And then after a 6-week period, we'll go back to the baseline levels.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a missed opportunity in that aspect.
I think that you have said it very well. I think it seems like a bit of a missed opportunity. Any other thoughts on this?
Just kind of a meta thought in that, research can be helpful to help us understand the effects of different diets at a population level.
Yeah.
But for an individual to decide what diet's best for them, it's really just, the best option is to really just try things and see how you feel.
Now, in this episode, I've talked a bit about cholesterol markers, which some of them can be incredibly valuable. And that is why I believe that it's very important that you know your baseline numbers. And a great way to do this is with Insight Tracker. They can provide you with a fantastic profile of not only cholesterol, but other inflammatory markers that may be of importance to you personally. They will give you a personalized plan to reduce stress, improve sleep, optimize your health for the long haul. And this has been created by many leading scientists in aging, genetics, and biometrics. Insight Tracker analyzes your blood, DNA, and fitness tracking data to identify where you're optimized and where you need to improve upon. You'll get a daily action plan with personalized guidance. And of course, they have a component to their blood work called Inner Age 2.0. So feel free to check that out. Now, for a limited time only, you'll get 20% off the entire Insight Tracker store. Just go to insighttracker.com/Dr. Lyon. And now back to our show. One of the things you've been really interested over the last couple of years is
the microbiome.
And why?
It's a really emerging area of science in the realm of human health. And
First of all, what is the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a microbiome on the skin and
in the brain,
gut,
everywhere, right?
Yeah, and now it's emerging that there's microbiomes everywhere. And basically, a microbiome is a community of different fungi, viruses, and bacteria that kind of form an ecosystem that is a part of us, even though we can't see it. It serves integral functions to the human body.
That is insanity.
Yeah. And so
that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah.
I mean, just the idea that there is a group of fungi and viruses and all kinds of this weird ecosystem of not even just bacteria. Who knows what it is? Our ability to measure it is it good?
It's not great because certain microbes can only survive under very specific conditions that can't be recapitulated in a dish or in a lab. So we are only really getting a sample of the population when we're doing a fecal sample or a skin sample or wherever we're taking a microbiome sample from. One kind of scary implication is that, for years, decades, we've been using different pesticides and fungicides and all of these chemicals in our environments thinking that it's not going to harm us. We aren't bacteria, we aren't fungi. But there's more bacterial cells in our gut than stars in the observable universe.
Okay.
And so it's in the hundreds of trillions. And, by harming them, we are harming ourselves. And, I talked about earlier how I was put on antibiotics when I was really young and how that affected the rest of my life, and how there's emerging research showing that antibiotic use can contribute largely to obesity later in life. So, by considering these microbes as other and not part of ourselves, we're kind of having to go down this whole other route of learning about the body and kind of under a new lens.
That's interesting. How did you even get interested in that? I mean, was it really from this idea that you used antibiotics when you were, 6 or 7, or was there something else that happened that you got interested in gut health?
So I had really bad ulcerative colitis when I was in my mid-20s.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really bad, probably for about 2-3 years. I ended up doing an elimination diet at one point to try to figure out if there were dietary triggers, and I found that dairy was a major trigger for me. And so I eliminated dairy strictly for 3 years. And, ultimately ended up becoming basically symptom-free. But also during that time, I had been discovering more about the microbiome, learning about how to cure food allergies and insensitivities, how to heal the gut. Because clearly, with something like IBS or ulcerative colitis, you're having a lot of inflammation in the gut. There's a lot of mucus production. There's bleeding.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of trying to understand what the gut needs to heal itself. And then obviously removing triggers is a part of that, but then also providing beneficial things as well. And I came across Joel Green's work and the Immunity Code, which is a book he released a couple years ago. And there's a gut protocol outlined in there, which is comprised of 3 very simple ingredients. It's basically an apple peel powder, a red fruit powder, and something called human milk oligosaccharides. And I'll basically unpack what each of those does.
And the first question everyone is wondering, maybe not everybody, but some people are going to wonder and say, there's a lot of talk in the gut space, right? So as a physician, we use ICD-10 codes and leaky gut, and the terms that are very common are not necessarily diagnostic. And one of the other things that we think about is we hear a lot about food sensitivities, and is that is that even considered real? Is there evidence behind it? Also, the protocol that Joel Green created, have you found it to be evidence-based, or is this an interface of evidence and clinical experience, which is also very relevant?
Yeah, so all of his protocols are rooted in primary literature.
Okay.
And then he used those in clinical population, like in clinical settings, and found major benefits and then kind of conveyed that to a general population in the book. I think it's super important to think about, whether things hold up and under a clinical lens. But there's also things like, people eat a certain food and they feel terrible after they eat it. Like
I would agree.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we know all the answers. I do think that there's an aspect of evidence-based medicine which is incredible and really should serve as a foundation and as a guiding post. But, as a person who sees patients in a clinical setting, there's absolutely something to be said for an interface of the non-hard science and the personal experience.
Absolutely. The empirical research with the published research. Yeah.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah. And so
you said apple peel, red powder,
and human milk oligosaccharides.
Human milk oligosaccharides. Well, we'll try again on that.
So we'll call them HMOs. And
yes, everyone knows what that is.
Each of these ingredients contain prebiotics. So prebiotics are molecules that we ingest that we can't break down with our digestive processes, but they basically reach to the colon and can feed microbes that live there. And so that's just like the general broad term for a prebiotic, whereas a probiotic is something that is basically a live organism that's living somewhere on you or in you, and that is basically promoting health. And then there's something also called a postbiotic, which I'll just touch briefly.
I've never even heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So a postbiotic is either a molecule that is extracted from a bacteria that would live, for example, in our gut. And then you can consume that to get some sort of benefit, or it's like a dead, inactivated bacteria that you're consuming to get some sort of benefit. So those are kind of like the three broad categories, but with a focus on prebiotics. So apple peel powder contains a very specific type of anthocyanin, which is a polyphenol molecule, which is an antioxidant. It gives it its color.
Gives it that color. And anthocyanin can be purple. Typically people think about the purple anthocyanins, and that would be
like red cabbage and blueberries, blackberries, foods like this. So any like bright colored fruits or vegetables, actually, they're made bright and pigmented by the antioxidant polyphenols that are present in them. But in addition to serving as antioxidants, they're also very potent prebiotics. So they travel to the gut and feed very beneficial microbes known as bifidobacteria.
Bifidobacteria, yes. Is there a way to measure these kinds of bacteria in a clinical setting?
So there are stool tests.
Yes.
You can certainly see relative changes. Like, let's say you take a baseline test and then you have a dietary change, and then you take another test. You can see like relative increases or decreases. However, there wouldn't be one set like absolute level that anybody would want to achieve. It's very personalized in that way.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because on the stool test, and we do actually use them in clinic, I always question, I always try to take the relevance with a grain of salt. I mean, there's certainly pathology testing, which I do a lot of, is certainly because many of my population in terms of my patients travel throughout the entire world. They come back with all kinds of very interesting additions to their gastrointestinal tract, which may or may not be fun. And there are ways in which one can test that. In addition, I do tests that may be a little bit more on the fringe of what a typical clinical practice would be. And we do look at aspects of Akkermansia, which I know that you're going to talk about, in bifidobacterium. And I always wonder, what, in terms of the numbers, is that actually relevant? If something is high versus low, certainly probably low is an issue, but there's probably individuality for all of them.
Totally. There's definitely individuality, and that's why it's really important to kind of establish a baseline if possible. Then you can kind of know relative to yourself.
Have you done these tests yet?
I have not yet, though I'm supposed to actually test them with Josh as part of a project that we're working on. And Josh Anthony.
So
Tracy's husband.
Josh Anthony is also a really profound researcher. He's amazing. And he's now in the private sector.
Yep. He runs a personalized nutrition, kind of like an umbrella company that's working with other nutrition companies to help them launch great products.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
So you were saying, human milk oligosaccharides, which I butchered that name, HMO, apple peel, which is interesting. Could someone just eat enough apple peel to make an impact? Could they peel apples and then...
So the original protocol was actually for like fresh apple peels.
Okay.
Now that the book has become more popular, the protocol's become more popular, companies have been releasing apple peel powder because it's easier for people, first of all, to do that than to like have to peel the apples themselves. And then obviously the waste of like the rest of the apple. If you
I would eat the whole apple.
Yeah.
I think that there's probably benefit to pectin, but maybe not in this
There is, but you would have to eat like 6.
Bring
like, you
it.
Eat like the 6 peels.
I got it. Bring it. I think that's interesting how he came up with these dosing. You know, the dosing is interesting. So yes, and you started implementing this, and you found that it actually changed.
Before I say that, let me just describe what HMOs are because they're super interesting and people might not have heard of them yet. So human milk oligosaccharides are prebiotics that were first discovered in human breast milk, and there's over 200 of them currently like identified.
Okay.
And essentially their role is to feed bifidobacteria in the infant gut. And essentially the baby's born, it gets some seeding like through the birth process of the microbiome, but the microbiome really gets established once these prebiotics, these HMOs, get introduced into the gut. And they're very good at feeding bifidobacteria specifically.
Why does anyone care about bifidobacteria?
Yeah, so bifidobacteria are super important for maintaining microbiome diversity and health overall. Bifidobacteria make 2 important molecules. One is lactate and one is acetate. And so these are both organic acids, which isn't important other than just to be more specific. And the acetate is also considered a short chain fatty acid.
Okay.
And there are 3 major short chain fatty acids that are present in the gut, and that's butyrate, acetate, and propionate.
And these feed the enterocytes?
So yeah, butyrate specifically feeds the enterocytes. So bifidobacteria doesn't make butyrate directly, but what it does is it makes acetate and lactate, which then go on to feed the butyrogenic bacteria, so the bacteria that make butyrate. And so by supporting their growth, there's ample butyrate that's produced, and then those can be taken up by the colonocytes, the colon cells, and serve as the major energy source for those cells.
And that's really important because it helps maintain gut integrity or even colon integrity.
Yep,
which,
absolutely.
Is important.
Yep, super important because there's harmful molecules within the microbiome as well. So E. coli, that's present basically in everybody's gut, will express things like LPS, which is an endotoxin. And if the gut integrity is compromised, LPS from like dead E. coli or other bacteria can basically get through the gut barrier. And what it does is it basically triggers off an inflammatory response throughout the whole body. Because LPS is lipophilic, which means it's attracted to fat, it can get stuck in the fat molecule, create an inflamed environment there, which then attracts macrophages, which actually further potentiates the inflammation because they basically are there to kind of try to ameliorate things, almost like to heal an injury.
So basically what you're saying is if an individual has some kind of impaired gastrointestinal, including the colon, intestinal lining, then it can create a flux of highly immunogenic or just toxic, I hate to use that word, but essentially toxic molecules, which can create inflammation throughout the body and probably difficult to identify. If someone was actually looking for it. So you might see inflammatory markers go up. Maybe would you see a SUD rate go up or a CRP rate?
Possible. Yeah, it could be also highly variable from individual to individual. I think you can measure LPS, but like the amount that might be present to lead to inflammation in one person might be different from another person.
Which is really interesting because the reason I say this is because when we look at standard blood panels, we do have a sense of what, even though it's typically the average of a whole bunch of sick people or perhaps non-optimized people, we don't even know in terms of gut microbiome what levels we're looking at, or even LPS. I don't measure that. And I would say that, our average blood draw is outrageous in terms of the markers that we're testing. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and there's also important implications there with obesity, because obesity is also linked to poor gut integrity. And so like the association of leaky gut to unhealthy fat tissue, which people think of fat as a storage organ for triglycerides, for fat, and it is, but it's also more than that. It's also an endocrine organ.
It is.
And it's also governing whole body immune status to a certain extent, because there's such a huge immune cell population present in adipose tissue.
Right.
Just to wrap up on the side of like inflamed fat being, resistant to releasing fat, basically.
So what does that mean? That means it's more difficult to
lose fat.
To lose fat because...
Yeah. Because that inflammation basically will create a hardened structure in the extracellular matrix around fat cells.
But this is above and beyond, say, dealing with calories. You're talking about the actual physical matrix of being able to mobilize and utilize the triglycerides that are stored in this kind of sick and inflamed adipose tissue.
Correct.
I wonder that implication in terms of skeletal muscle.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. We'll have to write our next paper on that after the other one that we're writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the inflammation in the fat is going to equate also to inflammation in the muscle for sure. And there's also a huge component of like muscle influencing immune status as well.
Yes.
And a person with inflamed fat is most likely to have fat present in their muscle, which is probably making sick muscle inactive. They're probably sedentary. So these things kind of spiral. But focusing on the gut is kind of an easy entry point for people, because it's not asking too much from them, and it's also not asking them to restrict anything. It's only asking you to add something in.
And you seem very sensitive to that because of your experience with how you felt around nutrition and kind of developing first an unhealthy relationship to food, because it's just a little bit of a theme that I'm hearing, that it's not restrictive. And
totally.
You do feel that there is really important practical application. I'd love to. So we're kind of at the balance of Akkermansia and what's the other one? Bifidobacteria. And the clinical applications above and beyond. So you said HMO, apple peel, and what was the last one? The red fruit powder full of anthocyanins. And are there other clinical applications and ways in which we can modulate and feed Akkermansia? Or is that pretty much the primary?
So Akkermansia, specifically of the 3 ingredients in the gut protocol, the apple peel powder is really great. Specifically, that pigment is really great at feeding Akkermansia. Also, grape extract is shown to improve Akkermansia levels.
And would someone just take that as a tablet, or? Yeah,
they can take it as a supplement. Essentially, any sort of like dark fruits are going to be great for the microbiome in general.
And you could just eat the dark fruit.
Yep.
Except it sounds as if, how much would one person, is there a way to quantify how much dark fruit an individual would have to eat?
So it would really depend. If you're already having like a clinical presentation of gut distress, you would have to play around with including different amounts. You could do a stool test to also see like your baseline Akkermansia, and then if you can get that increase, if it corresponds to an improvement in your symptoms.
So you keep dosing it up. And arguably there'd probably be other things. Number one, you have to remove the pathogen if it's there, and perhaps add in additional supplementation. Would you add in glutamine? Glutamine is really important for those enterocytes.
Yeah, so glutamine is critical, and this is actually something that would be interesting to touch on briefly, is that the colon's energetic needs are very different from the small intestine. So the small intestine relies almost exclusively on amino acids to create energy, whereas the colon relies primarily on butyrate.
Right.
And so amino acids in the form of like animal foods, for example, are really supporting your upper GI tract, whereas plant foods, indigestible plant matter, is really focused on feeding your bacteria in your colon, and then ultimately supporting your colon's health. So that's where, it really just makes sense from that level of analysis that, as omnivores, we are supposed to be eating both types of foods to get optimal gut health, and then that translates to overall health as well. In the absence of indigestible carbohydrates, so...
Which would be indigestible carbohydrates?
Like
fibers.
Yep, fibers, prebiotics.
Does it matter what kind of fiber?
It matter in what context?
Cellulose or soluble versus insoluble?
So basically any fiber will support short chain fatty acid production in the colon. The the prebiotics are, in general, very good at, especially HMOs are really good at supporting bifidobacteria, which can then go on to really boost butyrate levels. So you
take extra HMO, right? Because you're not drinking breast milk.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it could be. That would totally be weird. I am definitely not drinking breast milk. I'm not going to mention if Shane did or did not try breast milk for his HMO intake. I would just throw him under the bus there. No, he really didn't. Are you kidding? But yeah, that might be going to the black market, breast milk. Or you could just consider getting a HMO powder.
Yeah, and now there's like going to be more HMOs coming to the market soon that, the current one that's popular is called 2-fucosyl lactose. But like I mentioned before, there's actually hundreds of these, and there's like a good 5 to 10 new ones that are going to be in supplement form in the years to come.
That's really interesting. It makes me wonder, for those children, would there be any benefit for them to be on any kind of modified protocol? I'm not sure anyone can say if they should or should not, but it would stand to reason that perhaps if it's good for adults, that something of this nature would be really good for kids.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's best to start young, and like kids like evolutionarily would have been breastfed for up to 2 years.
Ouch, I would shoot myself.
And like
no offense to all those breastfeeding mothers, good job. Amazing.
Yeah, so I mean, those kids are getting exposed to HMOs for an extended period of time, and that's really establishing it's establishing the microbiome for them for the rest of their life. And it's also allowing them to have a healthy immune system, because virtually when you're creating the microbiome in an infant gut, you're establishing immunity, because there's this dynamic interplay between self and other that the body is starting to establish now that it's emerged into the world. It needs to kind of understand what should be attacked and what should be preserved.
Right.
And so that is all learned very early in life after birth, thanks to the microbiome's interactions with the gut tissues themselves and the immune cells. So the production of butyrate and other molecules can influence the development of immunity.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So in terms of nutrition, I'm curious. I know everyone is going to want to know, what do you eat?
So lately I've been
watermelon.
I do. I love my watermelon.
Some cookies in the background.
No, there were no cookies.
You're right.
She keeps lying.
I'm lying, but you know.
I have been very protein forward lately. I tend to do better on a lower starch, lower sugar diet. In general, I just feel much more energetic and just better overall. So I like to eat a lot of meat.
Is there any certain type?
Yeah, so I buy all my meats locally, and they're sourced from regenerative farms near me, which I like to support the local economy, and it's also better nutrition.
That's very conscientious of you, and also kind to a lot of the local farmers. Yeah,
and it's also just way more delicious, actually. So it's mutually beneficial. So
no, it's delicious because you know how to cook.
Yes.
If you were to put that into the hands of anybody else who didn't know how to cook, questionable.
Fair enough.
By the way, I will tell you, Alexis came over and I did air fry you a steak.
You did. That was edible.
Oh my gosh, it was literally like rubber. But anyway.
It wasn't that bad.
No, it was terrible. Just being kind. So you were saying, so you eat local regenerative agriculture.
Yep. Beef, chicken, sometimes pork. I like to eat fresh vegetables. I have a produce delivery box that I get.
Amazing.
Weekly from other local farms, and it's just whatever's seasonal. So I like to do that. I like to incorporate some more fruit and raw vegetables during the summer. I just tend to eat lighter during the summer.
And no issues. Since you went on this protocol, you have not had an ulcerative colitis flare up at all?
No, not in years. And
that's wild.
And in addition to that, so something that I didn't mention, but when I cut dairy out for years, I didn't get on the gut protocol right away because I didn't know it existed. But I, after eliminating it strictly for about 2-3 years, I reintroduced dairy and I actually had quite a strong immune response.
Okay.
So my throat was swelling shut, not to the extent where I had to go to the hospital, but it just mildly. And then I felt basically a hot sensation through my whole body. So which was it was telling me that there was an immune response, somewhat of an allergy. So I was pretty scared to eat dairy for a while, even after that. So I think cut it out for another 1.5 years before I found the gut protocol, heard other people's experiences with them healing their food allergies by consuming this. And so I was on it for a good 6 months, tried reintroducing a small amount of dairy, was totally fine. gradually just kept increasing it, and now I can literally eat anything, and I never
now
have
she sits
any
in the
issues.
corner and eats cheese
by the block.
by the block, just pouring it in.
Yeah, but it's great. And I also used to get like some bloating if I would eat beans or like raw vegetables, and now I can eat as much as I want of literally any food, and I feel great.
Amazing.
So it's really like been transformational for me.
Amazing. Well, people are going to obviously hear a lot more from you. You and I are collaborating on a few projects, and I'm sure people want to know where they can find you.
Yep. So I'm on Instagram at Dr. Alexis Jasmine. It's like DR and then Jasmine spelled Jazmyn.
And we'll link everything for you.
Yep. And then I also have a website. It's also dralexisjasmine.com. I've been kind of dabbling in a few different areas. So I've been working recently with the company Layer Origin, who makes some of these gut health products, including the HMOs. We've been collaborating on writing some pieces together, blog pieces, creating content, and trying to like expand reach. And so I'm their scientific content director now, which has been great. And I really appreciate their products. I've been using them for a while now. So it's been a good relationship. And I'm also working with some clients to help them optimize their gut health and other aspects of health, including fat loss and, whatever other goals people might have. And yeah, I mean, obviously we're collaborating a lot, and I'm so excited for everything that we're building together.
Yeah.
It's going to be great.
Well, people, you guys have to give her a follow. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending your time and for really being so receptive and sharp and just together. You are amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.